Welcome to our event. The topic today is understanding extremism, and this topic is this panel is supported by the Academic Engagement Network, as well as Southwestern University. And I'm so pleased to have our guests here today. We have Ayal Feinberg from Texas A&M Commerce. Ayal is Ayal is the leader of AEN's section for junior faculty, and this panel is also sponsored by AEN's section for faculty in the humanities, of which I'm chair, and I'll be introducing Jaquita Wilson-Kirby in just a minute. But just as a quick heads up, Jaquita Wilson-Kirby is a write-in candidate for Georgetown City Council seat, District 7. So if you want to stay active in local politics, that's important to keep track of. And for the May 22 election, coming up really pretty soon. And she is also an equity and inclusion facilitator. And so our first speaker is Dr. Feinberg, and Ayal's talk is entitled Hate's Counterintuitive Outcomes. Ayal, I turn over to you.
Hi guys, can everybody out in the Zoomosphere hear me okay? We can't see you, so I'm gonna be looking towards the camera and my audience out here, but I'm not forgetting about you guys. A huge thank you to Southwestern University and Michael Sanger for organizing and hosting this event. And also always a huge thank you to AEN for continuing their support of my work and programs like this. A huge thank you to the audience, both in person and online. It's really nice to be back doing in-person talks again. So I'm really excited about that here in beautiful Southwestern University. I also want to apologize in advance. I always apologize before any talk, but in the last 3 years, I've had the privilege of doing over 24 lectures, but this will be my very first talk without the aids of slides. I am a political scientist. That means I am completely over-reliant on statistics and figures and models and graphs. And I have to be honest, I feel really naked sitting in front of you guys here today. So I'm going to do my very best, but no promises. I can only promise you I'll do my very best to make this a thought-provoking talk. So let's get started. I want us to start thinking about hate at a conceptual level. So hate is often built on the preconceived notions of groups, specifically other groups. However, we often have preconceived notions of hate itself. And as with any preconceived notions, our untested assumptions of hate have the potential to be wrong. If the foundations of our hate are in fact wrong, the billions, yes, the billions of dollars we're spending to combat discrimination, prejudice, and bigotry all around the world may be misguided, even antithetical to what I hope are our shared normative goals. Unsurprisingly, I approach hate through the prism of an academic, given my training. As a Jew, I spend the majority of my time studying the hate of Jews, which is a phenomenon that we know as anti-Semitism. My talk today is largely going to be influenced by my experience, trying to learn and advance the study of anti-Semitism. Today, in this limited time that we have together, I really want us to think about what we know, but also what we don't know about hate. And even more importantly, I want us to think about the ways that we need to learn more about hate in the way that's the most expedient possible to advance our knowledge on this topic. To serve this purpose, I'm going to discuss 3 research questions that potentially have counterintuitive consequences, going from what I think is broad to specific throughout my talk. The last research question that I'm going to present, I have personally attempted to answer with a novel survey experiment I've co-authored with my amazing colleague at Washington State University, Dr. Jacob Scott Lewis. With this research only recently under review, I'm really excited that you guys will be among the first ever to hear about our research and our findings. And as such, during the Q&A portion of today's talk, I really welcome any questions and comments on this portion of my talk, but of course, everything. So let's talk about definition and identification. Let's think about definition and identification of hate. So let's start with a research question. I like to do that in all of my classes. One that has what I consider to be some baked in normative applications. What are the consequences for misidentifying too much or too little hate targeting a group? Before we can answer this question, let's turn to the most essential starting point for building any quality research. We need to define our topic of interest. Hate manifests itself in many ways around the world. Here in the United States, I think it's fair to say that its most common manifestation is in the form of racism. So what is racism? I want everybody in the Zoomosphere and our audience to take 20 seconds and try to define, think about how they would define the term racism. And I'll take advantage of this time by doing some more. Okay, the Merriam-Webster definition of racism is a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Of course, we can nitpick this definition, but I'm willing to bet everybody here and everybody out in the Zoomosphere, about 95% of us would have come up with something that's pretty close to that definition. If we wanted to get more specific, I would guess that the majority of us would be able to construct similar definitions of specific targeted hate, like homophobia, Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism. Therefore, and while it's perhaps controversial, I contend that one of the main problems we have in systematically studying hate is not definitional per se, but in recognizing when attitudes, beliefs, actions, and policies actually constitute an act of hate. At the individual level, just because something could be hate doesn't mean that we can clearly articulate it. All too often, we lack the pertinent details in the reporting of an incident. So then how do we know that something that should be recorded as an act of hate is actually an act of hate? Let me give you an example. A visibly Jewish man is walking down the street and gets spit on by a group of intoxicated men. Is this an act of anti-Semitism? Let me add some context. A visibly Jewish man is walking down the street in a Philadelphia Eagles jersey and gets spit on a group of intoxicated Dallas Cowboys fans. Is that an act of anti-Semitism? I'll provide even more context. A visibly Jewish man walking down the street, screaming profanities about the Dallas Cowboys directed at Dallas Cowboys fans, is then spit on by a group of intoxicated Dallas Cowboys fans. Is this an act of anti-Semitism? The answer in all cases is that we simply do not know. There is not enough information in any of these cases for us to actually determine whether or not the act was motivated by hate. And as I provided more context, which I think is counterintuitive, it became less and less clear, I think, to the majority of people that this is an act that maybe was motivated by hate. So the reason I bring this up is it exemplifies the challenges we have in trying to study hate empirically, especially at the individual event level. While an act of hate can have and often does have very visible motives, in many cases, the motives that we need certainty for in defining hate, we simply do not have. This challenges us, and it has a laundry list of consequences, some of which are counterintuitive. First, because of identification ambiguity, we could and often do over, but also undercount acts of hate. If we undercount acts of hate, scholars and practitioners could dangerously underestimate the threat facing certain target communities. But I want to focus on the flip side. If we overcount hate, we could be overestimating the threat facing certain target communities. When I discuss concerns regarding the recording of hate and data surrounding hate crimes and bias incidents, I find that the majority of individuals I speak to, academic, practitioner, and layman alike, all find that they use the mantra better safe than sorry. Their assumption is not necessarily incorrect. The more hate we identify, the more resources could be rallied to combat the problem. And I think everybody understands that position. However, this position fails to recognize the damage that over-reporting hate crimes can have on the communities that hate is directed against. While hate can induce social counter interactions and actions that might help to combat hate's manifestations, its most immediate and also its most lasting consequences on the communities that it targets is decreased visibility and social isolation. We know that in Europe, from multiple surveys, that the majority of Jews in Western countries of Europe now hide their identity frequently. They take efforts to visibly hide their Jewishness. And this is not unique to Europe. This is also true here in the United States, where recent polling suggests about 2/5 of American Jews hide their Jewishness in certain public situations. I want to move now to a different research question. What happens when overwhelming and explicit hate becomes the norm for a target community? For certain minorities around the world, social and political hate has become the norm. A good example of this scenario is the Jewish community in Venezuela, which was regularly demonized by dictator President Hugo Chavez and his supporters. Today, this legacy has continued, albeit to a lesser degree, by Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro. In an environment like Venezuela, negative stereotypes of Jews are widespread, despite the fact that Venezuela, specifically Caracas, has a notable Jewish community. Several years ago, I had the privilege of working with a very high-ranking leader in the State Department who discussed one of his trips to Venezuela with me. In particular, he described his experience meeting with Caracas's Jewish community. When this important diplomat arrived in Venezuela, he decided to meet with several of Caracas's most prominent Jewish community leaders. As a Jew, he was interested in understanding anti-Semitism there. So he asked them, "How is anti-Semitism in Venezuela?" They responded, "Anti-Semitism is intense and it is everywhere. We are very isolated in our community." "How horrible," he responded. "What can I do to help combat this anti-Semitism that you're facing?" They responded uniformly, "Please don't do anything. Don't do anything." It is the depths and intensity of anti-Semitism in our country that is the only thing that protects us. If they didn't think we controlled the world, they wouldn't fear the consequences of taking our property and attacking our families. So in the case of Venezuela's Jews, the conspiracy of the cabal, oriented in the protocols of Zion, the claim of Zog controlling the US, that's the Zionist organized government, no different than claims that we see expressed by neo-Nazis and the most extreme elements of white nationalists here in the United States, literally protect Jews from anti-Semites. To summarize, simplistically, hate, specifically wildly anti-Semitic beliefs, protects Venezuela's Jews from what they believe would otherwise be imminent harm. It's hate that provides them security. Consequently, attempts to alleviate the horrific anti-Semitism that Venezuelan Jews face were unwelcome from the very target community. Historically, this is not the first time stereotypes of Jews provided them security, or at least the possibility of it. In 1938, with pogroms and violence sweeping Europe's Jewish population and the stripping of citizenship from Jews in Germany, FDR called for a conference in Evian, France, to discuss the growing Jewish refugee problem. Only one state in the entire world at this conference agreed to accept additional Jewish refugees. I don't know in the audience what classes you guys have, but I will email your professors extra credit if you guys know what state this is. It was the Dominican Republic. The results of the Evian conference were actually used by Hitler to prove that Jews were the parasites he so often described. He said of the conference, "I could have only hoped and expect that the world, which has such deep sympathy for these criminals, Jews, will be at least generous enough to convert this sympathy into practical aid. We, on our part, are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries. For all I care, even on luxury ships." As he suspected, the countries seemingly appalled by Germany's treatment of Jews were unwilling to lift a finger to substantively help them. So what about the Dominican Republic? It had only been months, after all, since Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo's racism manifested into the Parsley massacre that killed roughly 20,000 Black Haitians simply for the crime of being Black. His decision to advocate for Jewish immigration was not a departure from this racism, but a continuation of his bigotry. Specifically, he saw Jews as very good with money, extremely powerful in business and in government, and ultimately their arrival in the DR would help to lighten the country and simultaneously expand DR's tax base and its wealth. Despite Trujillo's offer to provide some closure, only some 800 Jews were able to make their way to the Dominican Republic, which was extremely hard to reach from Europe. At the time, most of the Jewish refugees that were expelled from the Third Reich made their way to France or the British Mandate Palestine. I want to transition to, again, my last research question. So despite the story of Jews in Venezuela, we know that new manifestations of hate, such as bias incidents or hate crimes, have extremely negative effects on their targets. Individual victims of hate crime frequently suffer from PTSD. They're burdened by the fact that the motive of their targeting was, at their core, stable and often unchangeable characteristics that they possess. Individuals directly targeted by hate crime perpetrators are not the only victims, however. Hate crimes generally are really about targeting entire communities. That's why they've been called message crimes, because their initial effects spread widely, quickly, and deeply among the communities they target and intimidate. We know that communities subjected to hate crimes experience increased vulnerability and concerns about their security. So to introduce my final research question with some specificity, what happens when we see hate crimes targeting other communities on the news? Does our exposure to hate crime affect our policy preferences, particularly as it relates to issues associated with those targeted communities? I explored this research question with my co-author, Dr. Jacob Scott Lewis of Washington State University, by designing a novel survey experiment that we launched at the end of last year. We devised this survey where we exposed some participants to a news story of an anti-Semitic hate crime. Some of these vignettes had explicit added anti-Israel motivations, but others were just anti-Semitic alone. Others were exposed to a generic crime without any motivation of hate. And still others were not given a story at all. We call that our pure control. We hypothesized that being exposed to a hate crime induces sympathy and even empathy for the target group, which triggers what psychologists have called emphatic distress. To combat this emphatic distress, we assume people will want to take proactive policy positions that they believe prioritize the group targeted by the very hate crime they were exposed to. In our case specifically, we were interested in how exposure to hate crime targeting Jews in America would alter respondents' foreign policy preferences as it relates to Israel. I think our results were very, very compelling. We found that when compared to the pure control, that's those respondents that were not exposed to a hate crime narrative, those exposed to anti-Semitic hate crimes, regardless of whether they had the added element of an anti-Israel motivation, were significantly more likely to be in favor of foreign policy positions that support Israel. This include increased support for a general alliance with Israel, but also military aid for Israel and preferential trade agreements for Israel. I think these findings have considerable normative implications. While being the victim of a hate crime, both at the individual and community level, has lasting negative consequences, our research opens up the doors to suggest that hate crimes might include policy preferences that closely comport to the target group's preferences. For example, during the recent surge of anti-Semitic hate crime that we saw during the 2021 Israel-Gaza war, Congress put forward 12 bills and 16 resolutions pertaining to Israel and anti-Semitism. For the record, this is more congressional activity on anti-Semitism than the prior 2 years combined. Amazingly, I think our findings suggest baked-in counterintuitive consequences for acts of prejudice. And normatively, this provides, I think, a glimmer of hope to communities targeted by hate crime. For those seeking to commit a hate crime, you may hurt your victim. You may scare the community that you targeted, but ultimately, your actions could be very detrimental to your broader political goals and aspirations. And it is important to say this reality is not always unknown to the bigots and racists that we think are most likely to support violence, at least in theory. Immediately following the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre in 2018, an anti-Semitic hate crime that resulted in the murder of 11 Jews attending Shabbat services in Pittsburgh, one of America's most famous neo-Nazis came out and said, "What an idiot the perpetrator of the attack was." Why did he say this? Specifically, he said his actions would be extremely costly and detrimental to the cause of white nationalism, which he believed had otherwise been making tremendous political progress and was being mainstreamed in the Trump era. So to close, what I hope I've imparted for you today is that hate is really complicated. And in some cases, its applied outcomes are very counterintuitive. Our collective approach to the study of hate and the creation of policies to combat it will require considerable academic studies to examine this nuance in order to be successful. We need to constantly be thinking and testing our theories in order to do so successfully. How certain are we that an altercation or attack actually constitutes a bias incident or a hate crime? How actively and through what means should we be trying to combat stereotypes facing the victims of hate? How should the media report hate crimes? What role should hate crimes impacts on their direct targets, their indirect targets, and their broader community play in the media's decision whether to report these crimes at all? These questions don't even scratch the surface of the issues pertaining to hate and bigotry and racism that we as a nation face today. Yet I contend that anyone who truly cares about combating hate and racism in its modern forms must be thinking about these questions, refining them, testing them, and applying their findings if we are to make even a small dent in what seems sometimes like an overwhelming amount of prejudice all around us. So I want to thank everybody for their time, their attention, and of course, I welcome any questions and comments or harsh criticisms during the Q&A, and I really look forward to that. And thank you very much for allowing me to speak here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayal. Okay, so now we have the pleasure of welcoming our second speaker, Jaquita Wilson-Kirby. As noted, she is currently a write-in candidate for District 7 in the 22 election coming up in May. And the title of her talk is "Believe the Bad Guys When They Tell You Why They're Being Bad." Jaquita.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me here in Southwestern again, for allowing me to come and be a rebel rouser. I always appreciate coming on this campus and being really straightforward with the students. I really want to start with why I'm here. I'm here because there was a conversation with Whoopi Goldberg, who, said some things about the Holocaust that were not necessarily true. And she was villainized for that and had to face some extreme discipline and loss of income. And though I did not agree with her discipline, I also did not agree with her statement. And the reason why I did not agree with her statement is because what I said was Hitler told us why he did what he did. He was very explicit. Like, he was like, yeah, no, I don't like them. They gotta go. And however I get rid of them, I'm cool with. But they gotta go. And when we argue back and forth about why he would do that or what it actually was, or in the context of 2022, what it looks like, we're removing the agency of the bad person. The bad person said what they said, they meant what they said, especially when they say it with their whole chest. They're willing to spend a lot of money, time, energy doing this bad thing. Why wouldn't I believe that you were racist? That's what you said you were. You told everybody. Now, let's look at that in the context of America, okay? The bad people are telling us why they're doing the bad things. We're not believing them. We're saying, oh, they have mental health issues. We're saying, oh, their parents didn't love them. We're saying, oh, they're poor. And when people are poor, they get really angry and these things, bad things happen. No, a lot of the school shootings, a lot of the terrorist attacks, it's very clear why they did what they did. They tell you. They have a manifesto. They post online. They say, oh no, I killed those Asian women because they were Asian women and they were lusting after me and I had to get rid of them and make them stop. And instead, the sheriff gets on television and says, oh, he was having a bad day. A bad day. And that's a lot to swallow when you're of a marginalized group and a marginalized gender. Because I can walk down the street in New York City and get more hate comments in one block than I could in my whole life just hanging out in Mexico, Jamaica, somewhere. More comments. People are going to say, oh, you black bitch, excuse my language, or you fat this, or you ugly that. Now, why would I believe that that's why they have an issue with me when that's what they told me their issue was? See, hate is a thing about jealousy. It's a thing about insecurity. When somebody's insecure, trying to reason with them, logic with them, come up with an idea of why they're doing the thing doesn't make sense, especially when they tell you why. We're right now debating whether we had an insurrection or not, whether this was a terrorist act. When the people showed up and said, oh, we're taking over the government, we're gonna kill these people. We brought our nooses, but we were clear about what we want to do, but no. The government is going, let's talk about this. Let's sit down, be reasonable. Those people didn't really want to kill you, Mike Pence. They just wanted to have a conversation outside of work hours. But that's the reality of how this is being debated. It's like, oh, you don't know. And I will pull from something you said earlier about the 3 examples of how do you know it's hate. And in my head, I was going, oh, it was hate the whole time. And let me tell you how I know it was hate the whole time. No matter what way they spit on this Jewish man, what you ask yourself is, would they have done this exact behavior to somebody that looked just like them?
I didn't understand that.
I'm not talking to you, Siri. You know what I mean? Siri's like, I don't get it. And I see it. You know what I mean? I get that. It's a thing of, it's easier for me to abuse you if there's nothing about you that reminds me of me. I can negate your humanity if I can other you. Now, if I can't other you, I'm gonna have a bit more, I might give you a bit more leeway. You shout at me, I shout back at you. You know, I give you the middle finger, walk away, you know what I mean? But now, if you're representing the other, I may take that a bit further. And the numbers represent that. The statistics show, especially when we're talking about hate crimes against women, abuse against women. 99.9 times when they go and they do the after discussion with the man who killed his wife and the kids and everybody in the house and was just frustrated with his life. His boss pissed him off that day, who's male, looks just like him. And he went home and took that out on her. He didn't take that energy to the boss. Men are not getting angry and going, I'm going to go and start fights with other men in the street so I can release my anger. No, they're attacking women because that's somebody I feel like I can oppress more easily. And if I don't want to oppress the woman, I am looking for the obvious target. So that's why when you say obviously Jewish, I'm going, yeah, they spit on him because they hated him. If it wasn't obvious, we might see a different outcome. If I'm obviously Black, and I obviously am, when somebody says you Black, it doesn't matter what comes after that. It doesn't matter what comes after that. Because you could have called me short, because I am. You could have called me beautiful and still be mad because I am, but you didn't do any of those things. You went with the color situation. And when you do that, you're telling me what about me you hate. So I'm gonna believe you when you say it. I'm not going to ascribe you the humanity that you're gonna deny me and sit comfortably in that. Now, for my own safety, I might say, that's interesting, and walk away. But it doesn't mean that I believe that this person may have other motives. I'm always walking away going, oh yeah, they did that because I'm Black. That's why they have it. So unless someone tells me specifically, no, I did that to you because you're a woman. I did that to you because you're running for office and I don't like politicians. I did that to you because you were a teacher and I don't like teachers. People, when they don't like specific, they tell you. And I'm trusting them. And Maya Angelou told us, this is the wisest woman that walked this earth. When people show you who they are, you believe what they've shown. Anybody willing to spit on another human being is showing that they think that person is less than them. What is that outside of othering? If I'm gonna attack a human being over a game, for what is my win? Except that I feel good that I got to abuse this person. And I'm usually gonna get away with it. There's certain communities that I know I can get away with abusing. And there's not gonna be a committee. There's not gonna be congressional money. There's not gonna be anything. You just got abused. That's how this works. Now, Black men, there's money for, there's support, there are marches, there are rallies. But outside of Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland, how many Black women have died in police custody no one knows about? And the Black woman maternal mortality rate is 4 times anyone else in almost every state. And we're not seeing any money go to that. We're seeing anti-abortion stuff. Now, this was interesting to me about that. You're anti-abortion, and yet you also know these rates are looking like this. You're not trying to mitigate this death. You're only supporting this part here. So what does that tell me? What are you telling me? Not only are you advocating for my death, you will spend money and time and energy gaslighting me into thinking it's to save my baby. Not me. My baby without me should be fine. Lady, don't you want your baby to live without you? That's what you're saying to me. And I'm gonna believe you when you're saying it. And I'm going to treat you like you tried to kill me. And now you're shocked. You know, why is she talking to me like that? Why is she showing that kind of passion? Where is that vitriol coming from? Well, you just said to me, my death, my children's death, my girl's death is okay in your mind as long as there's some made up reason why they have to be forced to produce children for you. But it's not about you, Jaquita. It's about religion and God and, you know, doing the right thing for the next generation. But I'm like, these statistics don't seem to be going away, though, despite that. So if you're trying to do this religious thing, why are we not saving mommy and baby? Why are we not going 4 times is a lot? Can we at least bring it down to 2? 1? You know, I'll take 3 at this point. But we're not even discussing it. Nowhere are we discussing it. So even though it's happening, and even though everyone knows it's happening, we're not talking about it. There's no money, there's no support, there's no outrage, and that includes Black men. There's no march for the women that they're losing in childbirth. And that number is 10 times the amount of the deaths they have due to police brutality. So if we can't get support, we're not getting support from the men of our community. We're not getting support from the religious community. We're not getting support from the government. What is our community saying to us that I believe? Die. That's what the community's saying. And I have no problem putting my money, my time, my energy, just like Sir Hitler, into making sure you die. So I will never, ever, 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 ever argue with the bad guy when they say why they want me dead. Because they're very explicit about it. They almost are calling me by name. Yes, you, Jaquita Wilson-Kirby. I want your specific death. And I can't unhear that, no matter how many people say, it could be, it might be, we really meant, because the actions are, I'm burying my friends my age disproportionately to anybody else that I know. And I'm gonna believe those actions and I'm gonna believe those words because they both come to make a nice, pretty picture of what my community feels like about me. Thank you. Any questions?
So thank you to Jaquita, and I can say to both Ayal and Jaquita that I thought we were going to have a really good set of talks, and in fact, we got a great set of talks. Yeah. And I'm really deeply grateful for your courage and thought and honesty in bringing these perspectives to Southwestern, and also to the online community, people who are making hand clapping emojis. So I really want to thank you for bringing so much thought and value. to the conversation. And yeah, we open up for any questions or conversations in real life or online.
I get shy. Yes, please.
Sometimes my brain goes weird, so I was thinking about sort of finding in your experiment on having the obviously Jewish gentleman, and the participants, I presume, were not obviously Jewish. I was curious what an obviously Jewish participant they had actually done in that particular research, even on your line. Is that there's an other
Yeah.
in there, but now there's not an other. If the participant is not other. then that's
Interesting.
It's very interesting. Sort
And
of
Ayal, if you could maybe repeat the question for a moment before
For everybody else, so
answering
they
it,
couldn't
yeah,
hear
so
it.
for the microphone.
So the question was, so what would happen if there was perpetrators that were Jewish, I think is the question, and it's a really interesting one. We so I want to make some clarification here. The example that I was giving about the Eagles fan and the Dallas Cowboys fans, that wasn't the experiment that we run. That was more of a thought experiment for today's lecture. And the reason I brought it up was because I consider myself to be pretty visibly Jewish. And I've been at sporting events. I luckily have never been the target of any sort of simple assault like being spit on, but I've seen other people get spit on. And I was just thinking about if I had put myself in that situation, could other people, would they have interpreted it as hate? When I saw exactly this type of assault take place, where I don't think hate was a motivator. So simply by putting me in that position, would that then become hate, or would we count it that way? So that's why I brought that up. As it relates to the experiment, we did control for the perpetrator's religion and race, and we found that it didn't really have an impact on the findings that we were interested in, which was whether or not it would change policy preferences that favored the target group. So we did control for it, but I think what you're asking is really interesting too, whether or not that might have negative consequences for the perpetrators and policy preferences that we might associate with the perpetrators. So thank you for helping me write my next paper. I really appreciate it. It's an excellent question, and it should be something that we absolutely could do experimentally. Thank you.
And if I may, I want to give you a thought experiment. Internalized hate is a thing. In the Black community, we have a saying, all skin folk ain't kinfolk. And what we mean by that is there are Black people who hate themselves, who have internalized hate so much that they will inflict that hate on other Black people because they know they can't. So my question then to you is, does that change the dynamic of the example? If they're both people of color, is there still not hate involved? Because Black on Black crime is only a thing with Black people. Everybody else assumes proximity. But with us, it's like, no, it's a bit more serious. And so we look at other crimes through that lens of Black on Black crime and understanding internalized hate and how it shows up and how you will do something to someone who you think you can get away with doing something to in a way you wouldn't to the oppressive class, because you know you're not about to get away with that. You know, there's certain things I could do, I could say to other Black women that I know I can't say to white women. Get called cops on. It could be a whole situation that I could lose my life. So I know who I can mess with and who I can't mess with. But if you take it a little further to internalize hate, people that are actively thinking about, since I hate me and I don't think I should exist, neither should they.
questions as well. So I was wondering if there's a way that I can email questions later or something
Sure.
like that. Okay,
Sure, you can email it to me and I'll forward it.
great.
Do you have one you could throw out to the group so that they could also hear maybe the answers?
Well, I wanted to actually go a little bit deeper into the statistic about women, Black women,
Mhm.
in healthcare, because that is a statistic I've heard about before.
Yeah.
And I'm not exactly sure how I would prove that, but
Okay.
there is a question I do want to dig deeper into that a little bit, and then I do want to talk a little bit about your second research question. But again, so there's some things I do want to to follow up. I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But I do have to wrap it.
No problem.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr.
So anybody in the Zoomosphere, Mike?
I will ask that.
There's an interesting study right now being done by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Health Equity Collective, mirroring all of these things that I'm talking about, but also holding the information. And I'm hoping that when she emails, I will be able to get the website for her so that she could see all of the different ways that intersectionality is at play in these things and why I'm mentioning them in a conversation about hate in the first place. So that's why I asked her, like, okay, let me know what I need to be looking for before you email me. But I'll have it already ready. But yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you. Nothing's coming in from the Zoomers. Does anyone else in real life have a question or?
I love your nails.
All right. I think we can call it. So thank you so much for coming. And thank you for coming to speak. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And thank you to all of y'all on Zoom.